Welcome back. It looks like I did lie a little bit. It's 20 after, but I will try to keep us on time today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Kim Brawley is a dietitian here at Seattle Children's who focuses in inflammatory bowel disease and is an integral part of the Inflammatory Bowel Disease Center. Kimberly graduated from Oregon State University in 2010. She proceeded to complete a dietetics internship at UC Davis Medical Center in Sacramento, California. And working at UC Davis as a clinical dietitian, she returned to the Pacific Northwest to join our multidisciplinary team. She has been integral in the success of the SCD here at Seattle Children's, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce her and the talk she's giving on nutritional adequacy of the specific carbohydrate diet. Kimberly.
Okay, it's such a privilege to be able to speak to all of you about some of our experiences at Seattle Children's Hospital, and in particular focusing in more on the nitty-gritty nutrition in the specific carbohydrate diet. I'm especially excited because there are so many people from all over different backgrounds, different specialties, all over the countries. We have physician assistants, dietitians, physicians, families, psychologists. It's just wonderful to have you all. Again, I will tell you what we're going to review. We'll start with a case study and move on to nutrient intake standards. And my hope is that you all will leave with an understanding of what nutrient intake standards are. We will identify nutrients of concern in inflammatory bowel disease that we think of when we're assessing a patient. And then I hope that you leave with a better understanding. We've learned a lot today about the specific carbohydrate diet, but we'll learn even more from the nutrition side. Our case today opens with a 14-year-old male with newly diagnosed Crohn's disease. His symptoms at the time of presentation were abdominal pain, diarrhea, and food aversion. Does this sound common or well known by anyone here? His first endoscopy results grossly showed chronic mild duodenitis, moderate erosive colitis, and moderate ileitis with ulcerations. At his initial meeting with the dietitian, he was diagnosed with mild malnutrition based on his Z-score, and because of his weight loss of about 5% body weight before being diagnosed. In this country and kind of worldwide, we're trying to come up with a standardized definition of malnutrition, and we're also trying to identify it earlier to prevent long-term health risks and implications of malnutrition. I'll talk briefly just about the Z-score. The Z-scores are for population-based assessments. They're used to standardize data on one scale, and the Z-score is the distance that one person's BMI is from the mean or from the average, as we know, kind of the 50th percentile. And a change in Z-score of an individual anthropometric, whether it's BMI, weight, or length, represents growth velocity. So it's been very helpful having the BMI Z-scores to assess malnutrition. You can see here that this is our patient's growth chart at the time of presentation to our GI clinic and prior to starting his therapy. You can see that the BMI Z-score right there is a negative 1.32, which gives him the diagnosis of malnutrition. The family decided to pursue induction therapy of exclusive enteral nutrition for 8 weeks. He started on the diet, again, consisting of that commercial formula and water, and that was all he could drink for the 8-week period. Initially, his C-reactive protein was 7.7 and then dropped to 3.8. However, at our institution, normal is less than 0.8. He continued with some mild GI symptoms, And he also had a difficulty maintaining the diet. We call it flavor fatigue, and you can imagine drinking a sweetened beverage for 8 weeks would be pretty tiring, and these kids are amazing. Some kids receive the formula by mouth, and some say, I want to go the nutrition route, but I just can't drink it. And then we place a NG tube, or a nasogastric tube, and they can receive the formula through the tube. The family then had to decide on what they wanted to do for a maintenance therapy, and everyone was in agreement to try the specific carbohydrate diet. The DRIs, or the dietary reference intakes, are the most commonly known nutrient intake standards here in the United States. They're used by dietitians, physicians, probably naturopaths, across the board to kind of provide, and they're providing reference values for energy and nutrients based upon population data. So they provide values both for the calories and for the vitamins and minerals. They're used for assessing diets for individuals and groups, and they are goals that can be achieved over time. They're also great to have for planning and assessing diets for healthy people, and to set standards for food assistant programs, group facilities such as daycare, nursing homes, and also schools. The DRIs were established by the Food and Nutrition Board, which is an arm from the Institute of Medicine, and they were actually started in the 1940s due to the national importance pertaining to the safety and the adequacy of the nation's food supply. The main focus of the Food and Nutrition Board is to evaluate emerging knowledge of nutrient requirements and the relationship between diet and the reduction of risk of chronic diseases, and to use this knowledge to prevent the chronic diseases. So the DRIs are broken down into subgroups, and bear with me for a moment as we jump into some definitions. They will be important to know for later in the presentation. The first is the estimated average requirement, or the EAR, which is the amount of a nutrient that is estimated to meet the requirement of that specific nutrient in 50% of people of a specific age and gender. The EAR is used to set the RDA, or the recommended dietary allowance, which is the average amount of a nutrient that is sufficient to meet the needs of 97 to 98% of healthy individuals, again, of a specific age and gender. The RDA is for individuals and not for a whole group, whereas the adequate intake is more for groups. The tolerable upper intake level, or the UL, is the maximum amount of a nutrient that is unlikely to pose any health risk of adverse effect in most healthy people. The first four are broken up into by vitamins and minerals, and the last two are for macronutrients, so our fats, protein, and carbohydrates. The estimated energy requirement is the average calorie intake predicted to maintain energy balance in a healthy individual, and for those we have prediction equations for different population, different for obesity, for the general individual. So there are lots of different ways we can calculate energy prediction equations. And lastly, the acceptable macronutrient distribution range is a range of intakes of a particular energy source, so our carbohydrates, fat, and protein, which is associated with a reduced risk of chronic disease while still providing enough of that nutrient to meet bodily essential functions like essential amino acids and essential fatty acids for fats. There are a couple other organizations, the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization also provide nutrient intake standard references, and they've kind of combined with each other and have come up with some standards, but more on a global population basis. So they're looking at slightly different aspects to have established their reference ranges, but overall they're relatively similar to the DRIs. And lastly, I wanted to mention the NHANES nutrient database. The NHANES is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and it is a research program that assesses the health and nutrition status in adults and pediatric patients in the U.S., and the goal of the NHANES data is to track changes over time. In 2012, the NHANES group produced a survey for kids ages 3 to 15, and there was somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 kids that were enrolled in this survey. They evaluated health assessments, and part of that evaluation were diet recalls. So they obtained 24-hour diet recalls, and from that were able to have kind of a control or a database of just the general nutrition intake for kids in the United States. We know that nutrition in inflammatory bowel disease, as we've heard today, plays a tremendous role, both possibly in the management, and then also nutrition is significantly affected by the disease. In a brief overview, in Crohn's disease, weight loss is seen in 60 to 90% of individuals. Growth failure is seen in 30% of pediatric patients. Micronutrient deficiencies are common, and then bone loss is also prevalent. In ulcerative colitis, weight loss is a little less prevalent but still common in 20 to 25% of kids. Growth failure occurs in 5 to 10% of kids, and bone loss is also common. There are several nutrients from a nutrition standpoint and from the physician standpoint that we look at together as a team, and we'll either check a lab or evaluate if one is getting adequate intake of that nutrient. The first and most common deficiency that we see is iron deficiency anemia. You can see the iron is absorbed in the duodenum, or the upper part of the intestine, and it is prevalent in about 17% of patients. We know that with the inflammation, a lot of these kids and adults have chronic blood loss when they're flaring, but also some medications such as PPIs can inhibit the absorption of iron. Calcium is another nutrient that we don't necessarily check from a laboratory standpoint, but that as the dietitian I'm thinking of as I do an initial assessment. I have the privilege to meet with most of our patients that are diagnosed or come to our center here at Children's Hospital. And so my practice is to assess, does this child have intake of calcium? Because we know that they're already at a disadvantage and a higher risk for bone disease. Most of these kids are on some sort of elimination diet, or they're already excluding milk because it worsens their symptoms or they've been told to do so. So that kind of eliminates the best source of calcium absorption, which is through dairy. Also, chronic inflammation can worsen bone loss. PPIs also can inhibit the absorption of calcium. And steroids, we know, have a huge impact on bones. Folate or folic acid is a nutrient that can be deficient secondary to medication, such as methotrexate and sulfasalazine. So our practice is to preventatively start patients on folic acid supplementation. Our doctors are awesome at doing that. But also, if there's ileal inflammation, a patient may be at risk for folate deficiency. Similarly, vitamin B12 can be a deficiency for kids that have inflammation located to the ileum, or if they've had any bowel resection, especially of the terminal ileum. So we will check a vitamin B12, not always, but if one has inflammation in that area. And lastly, the fat-soluble vitamins D, A, E, and K are nutrients that we think of in inflammatory bowel disease. Vitamin D, of course, is a hot topic kind of across the board, but especially in inflammatory bowel disease, there's emerging evidence showing that it plays a really beneficial role in the immune system. So we're really working at trying to get levels to where we want them to be. Given where we live, most of us are deficient in vitamin D, but also because of the immune response with IBD, it's really important that most of our patients be assessed for how deficient they may be. Vitamins A, E, and K are less commonly seen deficiencies, but they do occur especially if a patient with, for example, ulcerative colitis comes into the hospital and is stooling upwards of 10 to 20 times a day, waking up at night, has malnutrition. We will usually check the fat-soluble vitamins. Knowing that nutrition is greatly impacted in inflammatory bowel disease, we've approached exclusion diets with great caution here. I think just in Western medicine in general, we don't typically treat diseases as often with diet unless it's celiac disease. Dr. Suskin went into a lot of detail about this diet, but the SCD can be a nutritionally complete diet. It's grain-free, low in sugar, and low in lactose. It was developed by the pediatrician, Dr. Sidney Haas, in the 1920s, 30s to treat celiac disease, and as he mentioned, it was a very common therapy at the time. It wasn't until later that they found, it's only gluten that we need to remove. And then Elaine Gottschall's daughter was treated with a specific carbohydrate diet, had great results on the diet, so she dove into kind of what could it be about this diet and published the book, Breaking the Vicious Cycle. Dr. Suskins shared some of our initial kind of preliminary studies, but up until now, mostly we've had anecdotal reports of symptom improvement and beneficial aspects of the diet. However, there's been limited research of larger studies. On the diet, allowed foods are meats, poultry, fish, shellfish, and eggs, certain legumes, and all natural nut butters, dairy, but it's limited to cheddar cheese, Colby, Swiss, dry curd cottage cheese, how many have heard of that one? And homemade yogurt, which has to be fermented for over 24 hours. But it's one of my favorite parts of the diet because it is a great source of calories. Most fresh or cooked vegetables and string beans, fresh or dried fruits, most nuts and nut flours, most oils, teas, coffees, mustard, cider, or white vinegar to flavor food, and 100% fruit juices are allowed. Honey is the only sweetener on the diet, which can be problematic at times. So sugar, molasses, maple syrup, sucrose, any processed fruit, all grains are not allowed on the diet, as well as starchy tubers such as potatoes, turnips, sweet potatoes, canned vegetables and fruits with added ingredients, some legumes, seaweed and seaweed byproducts, most processed meats, canola oil and commercial condiments, all milk and milk products that are high in lactose, and lastly, of course, candy, chocolate, and products that contain fructooligosaccharides. As our case study started on the SCD, he would bring me 3-day diet recalls of what his diet looked like so that I could track, okay, is he meeting his nutrition requirements, right? Like any dietitian, we need to make sure. And an example day looked like this: scrambled eggs, butter with bacon, and an SCD waffle. As you sampled this morning, waffles and kind of baked goods are made from nut flours and also coconut flour. It gives a little bit of a different texture, but it's still kind of producing a similar product. Lunch is chicken, salad with SCD homemade ranch dressing. For a snack, he had SCD yogurt that was made from either half and half or whole milk, as they would have told him. And dinner consisted of pork tenderloin, butternut squash, and carrots. For his other snacks, he had SCD zucchini and apricot muffins. So looking at this comes into play at the same point as when we had families coming to us saying, we really want support with this diet, it's working. Will you partner with us and look at it from a laboratory standpoint? So of course, we had to see, well, is this diet meeting the nutrition requirements? What does it look like? So this is a retrospective look at 4 individuals who had, of that 7, who had been on the specific carbohydrate diet. They didn't have any prior nutrition counseling, and this is what their intake looked like. So up at the top, we have the RDA, or the recommended dietary allowance needed to meet that 97 to 98%. And then you can see the patients on the bottom. Patients met the RDA for most nutrients, but you can see clearly here all 4 drop at thiamine, or B1. Vitamin D, all 4, there's a trend that they drop, probably because a lot of dairy is excluded. And then calcium as well. So we said, okay, what are the sources of these nutrients that they can still get on this specific carbohydrate diet? And we were able to take that information and start counseling on, okay, we need to make sure you either have cheese, yogurt, or a supplement that has calcium and vitamin D. This led to our prospective study in 2014 to 2016, and you saw some of the laboratory improvements that these patients had. 9 individuals went onto the diet here at Children's for a period of 12 weeks. Vitamin D was assessed at baseline. From what we learned, their diet was limited, and we supplemented with vitamin D. It's standard of care here. We check a vitamin D and supplement if it's low. Food intake records were collected at weeks 2, 4, 8, and 12. So we had a total of about 12 food logs for each patient. The foods were then input into a nutrient analysis program, and the results of those nutrients were compared to the RDA, that upper limit, and the EAR, so going back to those definitions. This is a comparison of our prospective study results to the NHANES data, and this shows the vitamin intake statistics for the individuals in our prospective study compared to the reference, which will be the NHANES survey data I was talking about. The whiskers here represent the full range of values. The tops and the bottoms of the boxes show the 75th and the 25th percentiles of the data, respectively, and the lines represent the median. The line in the middle of the box represents the median, and the circle indicates the mean. So if it's quite a ways above the median, the circle is telling us that some of the results are skewed by levels that were much higher than the normal or the average of the sample. And if the circle is below the line, it shows that there may be some values that were skewing the data below. Some of the nutrients that I want to point out, we won't jump into all of them, but you can definitely ask questions. The first being thiamine. Again, we're going back to that B1 vitamin. About 25% of our SCD group met the RDA requirement, so that 97 to 98% for B1 or thiamine. Sources of thiamine include whole grains, of course. A lot of the B vitamins are received through grain products, so it's something that I always thought of, okay, is this going to be a deficiency for this patient? But it's also found in meats and fish as well. So for patients that are eating meats and fish on the diet, they should have a reasonable intake of thiamine. You can see here for this vitamin that the NHANES data, about 75% of individuals met the RDA for that vitamin. Overall, the SCD is not that far off from the control group, which definitely to my astonishment, as I've looked back over the years and reviewed kind of the nutrient intakes of kids on the diet, because a big concern for most families coming in and a lot of providers is, well, it's an exclusion diet. Are these kids going to meet all the needs all their requirements? And we're seeing here that they can with proper counseling and if they eat a variety of foods. I keep doing that, sorry. The next nutrient that we're going to look at is vitamin B9 or folic acid. Actually, the SCD group had a higher percentage of individuals that met the RDA for folic acid. If they're below the RDA, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a deficiency at all, because they still could be meeting 50% of the requirements for that food, which in my mind is still pretty good. The NHANES group, only 25% of the individuals met the RDA for folic acid. My suspicion is because folic acid is seen in a lot of dark leafy green vegetables, but it's also very prevalent in fruits, nuts, beans, peas, and some dairy products, as well as seafood. So, as we know, this diet consists of a ton of almonds, a ton of peanuts, a ton of seeds. So these kids have an excellent intake of folic acid. The last nutrient we'll look at is vitamin D, and if our kids were deficient, they were supplemented on the vitamin D, which is not shown here. Looking at the same concept, but looking at minerals and trace elements, the RDA was met for 50% of the SCD group for all nutrients, aside from calcium. Right there. However, again, it's not very far off from the NHANES data. Now looking at the tolerable upper intake level, kind of the maximum amount that we know is safe. The upper limit was met for vitamin A in 75% of individuals, and that's the big one I want to point out. So on the SCD, 75% of the kids exceeded the upper limit for vitamin A. However, from that, we learned that we need to kind of check the vitamin A levels in our next study, and we've been checking, and their levels are totally normal. Vitamin A is in eggs. These kids get a ton of eggs in their baked goods, scrambled eggs. We know it flavors things, as Dr. Suskin mentioned, so it's in everything, but also in the fruits and vegetables that they eat. The upper limit was about 50% of kids met the upper limit for magnesium, but the upper limit for magnesium is established or has been established from a pharmaceutical supplement. So we're not looking at kind of a realistic picture of, it's more like comparing apples to oranges. We don't know how excessive magnesium, what the upper limit would be for that. We do know that if we give kids supplements of magnesium at high amounts, we see diarrhea or just loose stool, and which is hard to sift through with these kids due to the nature of the disease. For most nutrients, intakes were well below the upper limit. And then looking at energy and protein, I have yet to do the breakdown of fat, but because carbohydrates are significantly limited in this group, I imagine their intake of fat is also more than average. The kids met 100% of what their prediction was as far as energy intake, and we know that kids with inflammatory bowel disease have higher requirements for calories at baseline. Most gained weight during the study, and we'll see our case study in a little bit. And there is a control for protein from the NHANES data. We can see that intake on the SCD group of protein is significantly higher, which is expected due to the limited carbohydrate intake that they have. We know with any therapy that the SCD is not necessarily for everyone. Our selection criteria that we've been developing looks like this. From a nutrition standpoint, we assess for malnutrition and any growth stunting. We have not seen that the diet reverses any linear stunting. However, we have seen a lot of catch-up weight gain. Is there family support and involvement? It's essential. They do everything. Do they have more time to devote to cooking, shopping, meal planning? And does the kid want to be a part of it as well? We look to see where the location is of the disease and how severe are they. We've had the best luck with kids with mild to moderate inflammatory bowel disease on the specific carbohydrate diet. We have not had as much success with those with severe disease. Equally, we have not seen reversal of extraintestinal involvement. So any fistulas, stricturing, we haven't seen reversal like some medications can have. And then we screen for these nutrition labs. And this list, I think, will grow longer so we can have a baseline of vitamins like vitamin A and vitamin D. But right now we look at vitamin D, hemoglobin, hematocrit, possibly a vitamin B12, and then a methylmalonic acid level if we do check the B12. And then we supplement those vitamins or minerals if indicated. During the initial meeting with the dietitian for kids that are interested or want to start on the SCD, we talk about allowed and excluded foods like we've done today, how to transition to the SCD, what current therapy are they on? Are they on exclusive enteral nutrition? Are they on a regular diet? Are they on a very bland diet? And we talk about what that can look like and what time frame it should be done. I think this is especially important to talk about because we have a lot of families that come from all over the country to have counseling on the diet and to just have some support from a medical side, and we call it second opinions. And they come in, they've been on the initial stages of the SCD for months and months and months, thinking that they can't get past those broths and Jell-O. And this kills me, thinking, this kid isn't doing very well, and he's been limited to Jell-O and applesauce for 4 months. So I really say how important it is to move through the stages, even if symptoms are not 100%. We don't want further weight loss than kids already have. As far as meal planning goes, families are looking at, I skipped budgeting. That's the most, someone asked a question about budgeting, and we've, from our experience and having tried the diet, we anticipate that about $50 to $100 more per week per individual for the diet. But you're not going out to eat as often, and you're also saving money from medication. We had one individual who was progressing to require a Remicade, but the family really wanted to try the diet first to see if it worked, to give it a shot. She went onto the diet and went back into clinical remission, and has been up until this point, potentially saving hundreds, if not thousands of dollars up until now, not needing Remicade. And then we also talk about weight loss prevention. I always say, okay, you need breakfast snack, lunch snack, dinner snack. This is your therapy, and we can't see weight loss or it's not working. You know, we anticipate a little bit initially as they're transitioning, but then we want to see growth like we would with any other therapy. It's one of the indicators that the therapy is working. I encourage them to have fat and protein at each meal, if not each snack, so that they do feel more satisfied and they don't come in reporting, I'm hungry all the time. And usually they tell me that they're hungry all the time, and I see what they're eating, and it's a Lar bar, maybe if on a good day, a fruit leather, then fruit, then an apple, and I say, we talk about this. You know, you need to have a protein and a fat at each meal. And then resources that we give are various handouts describing the diet. With the handouts also, one of the handouts is in your packet that you received today that we give, and it gives a list of websites, blogs that they can go to. We provide cookbooks. One of them is Dr. Suskin's book that you guys all have. Websites and blogs, and then family contacts. And we've talked about it today, but can't say this enough. I think part of the success we've had has been because of our family support. And if anyone needs a resource or wants to talk with another family who's been through this, let me know today. Some of our families are here today, and they would love to talk to you as well. So feel free, please chime in. Also, we have a Facebook group that one of our families has started. And these families will go with you to the store. They'll show you, this is how you meal plan. They'll bring their snack packs. They let me have their snack packs today. We've got sunflower seeds, oranges, muffins, string cheese, Cliff Bar, applesauce. I mean, most kids are having chips, and we say that this diet isn't adequate. I mean, this looks like awesome snacks to me. Carrots, trail mix, a cool-looking bar that I have no idea what that is. Something they've come up with. And they have the best recipes. Hopefully you enjoyed some of the foods out there. One of my favorites is that cheese cracker. Special considerations that we think of for kids that want to start the SCD is, are they vegan or vegetarian? When they say that they are and they want to start the SCD, I kind of cringe a little bit because I'm like, okay, well, how are we going to get our B vitamins? How are we going to get, we'll have good intake of vitamin E and through our peanuts or our almonds, but it can be really hard to already have diet restrictions or exclusions and then starting on another elimination diet. Is the kid a selective eater, as I like to say? AKA, are they picky? Or do they have another disorder such as autism that predisposes them to already kind of having food aversions to various colors, textures? I have a lot of kids come in that look like this guy, and vegetables is always the issue. It's never fruits, it's vegetables. Some kids come in and say vegetables are their favorite food, and I said, okay, you're going to do great on this diet, but not always. And then, are they an athlete? You know, most teenage kids are either doing cross country, they're doing track, they're doing, hopefully not crack. That was not intentional. So we talk a lot about sports nutrition and fueling their body to have the optimum outcome for their sport. A lot of, especially adolescent males, are really nervous about further weight loss and how am I going to do my cross-country running. So I've had swimmers, I've had cross-country runners make state on the diet, say that they've had their best swimming outcomes. It's not for everyone, again, if the therapy is not working, but when they're doing well, it works. And they even know how to fuel their body for running because we've talked about it. If a child has a lot of food allergies, in particular to nuts or seeds, the diet can be much more challenging, and we have to look at how can they receive those nutrients that they are not going to get. And nuts and seeds are a huge part of the calorie intake that these kids have. So we want to make sure it's a true food allergy first, and then this diet may not be appropriate for them depending on if they have any other aversions or foods that they dislike. And lastly, we look at age, and Dr. Suskin mentioned one of our 6-month-olds, but that really sticks out to me as a memory was his story. He started on exclusive enteral nutrition with actually an elemental formula is what he was on, and then transitioned at about 6 months of age, started with First Foods as SCD foods. The family was not socioeconomically well off, so we thought, can this happen? But we want to support them as best as we can. I wish we could give them financial support, but up until this point, we have no means of doing that unless they're in our study where the chef cooks for them. Additionally, this family's diet, they had 2 older boys, both of whom were obese. Their diet consisted of processed foods, pre-made meals, sugar cereal, all the things we talked about today with food additives that all of our kids eat. And they did it. Over the course of now he's 2, they've transitioned to the SCD, and it has improved the quality of all of their diets, not just his. So in that case, I think they made a significant change that they'll continue forever. Plus, he's still in remission. So what we've learned with this, we have learned so much, and we continue to learn so much from our experience, but from the families mostly. As we counsel families, it is so important to be encouraging and also realistic. You can do this, but yes, it is more expensive. You need to have time on the weekends to batch cook or to freeze things to have on hand. It's so terrible to go somewhere and your child says, I'm hungry, and then you have nothing you can give them because it's all something from a vending machine or a cafeteria. So having those on hand is essential. It's imperative to set them up for success, providing resources and allowing for a transition period. So during their initial visit, as dietitians, we give them those resources that they need to be successful. We evaluate both physical and emotional readiness. Maybe from a physical standpoint, their disease may be too severe, that they really need to move on to something quickly. But emotionally, Dr. Cunningham will expand on this, but are they in an emotional place, and can they sustain the diet? Or is it too hard for them to not eat what their friends are eating, to not be able to go to spaghetti feeds, to not go out with their friends to a Mexican restaurant? And there are restaurants that you can modify the food, but this is a huge challenge. And what we've learned from families, children are so resilient. They never fail to surprise me on what they can do. We have kids placing their own feeding tube for therapy. And I just say, teach me to do it. I need to do this with you. But they wow me, and never underestimate the family. I've had families come in that have no idea how to cook. And they say, we really want to try this. And I make sure that they know that this diet is available if it could be an appropriate therapy for them. If they haven't heard about it, because they'll hear about it from a friend, or they'll hear some other nutrition advice from their family member, and I want them to know what is true when they come and meet with us. And these families who don't know how to cook have learned to cook through this process and are saying, we're cooking for our child now. It's really empowering to them. My advice from our experience would be, do not miss an opportunity to offer this diet as a therapy option if it is an appropriate treatment, whether it's, go to this institution and they do it, or giving them a few resources that you have. We are always here as a resource to contact if you have questions, because we know that not every institution uses diet or the SCD as therapy. Exclusive enteral nutrition is a worldwide accepted therapy, and it's used in Europe. It's used in Europe as first-line treatment for IBD over steroids. But the SCD is yet to kind of expand like you were talking about. So that's our goal, is that the kids that could do well on the diet will learn the information. Wrapping up with our case study, kind of looking at his overall intake, these are the electrolytes and minerals, and you can see the black line is the percent of the recommended dietary allowance. He met 80%, if not 100% of the RDA for all the electrolytes and minerals when I did his diet analysis. Again, that magnesium value is based on the oral supplement, so I don't think he had excessive stool output or anything from eating more magnesium. And for the vitamins, oh, sorry, I forgot to mention the red indicates the upper limit, so how much more this patient could have had before he met the upper limit. Again, he met 100% of the RDA for all vitamins, aside for vitamin D and vitamin K. He was on a vitamin D supplement because his vitamin D was low initially, and it did come up to normal by the end of the study. Our patient completed 12 weeks on the SCD and thrived. He reached clinical remission with a normalization of labs. And he not only had his weight restoration, but had weight gain above where he had been before. He continues on the SCD and has been on the diet for 1 year and 9 months. He's been able to successfully add back cocoa powder, organic potatoes, white rice, and chickpeas. And his inflammatory markers are still great. And that is our main goal, that the diet doesn't stay so restricted that it's not sustainable and that the child feels even more socially burdened that I can't go out with friends. But our goal is to liberalize the diet as much as we can while still managing the disease, either in conjunction with medication therapy or as a sole therapy on its own. Here's his growth. Again, that's where he came in with the diagnosis of mild malnutrition. Started on exclusive enteral nutrition for 8 weeks, and this had a little bit of weight gain, but not much. And at that point is where he transitioned to the specific carbohydrate, and you can see his BMI Z-score was beautiful, and also he was at the 50th percentile for BMI. To wrap things up, the SCD can be used as therapy to reach remission for pediatric patients with IBD. It's not an appropriate therapy for all patients, however. Detailed education and close monitoring by a multidisciplinary team is essential to the success. And as always, further research is needed regarding the effect of diet and IBD. Any questions?
Patients who are starting off with very low albumin?
That's your favorite question. Dr. Suskin will be the first one to ask that question. Is albumin a nutrition marker? And he mentioned we don't use albumin as a nutrition indicator because it is a negative acute phase reactant. So no matter what, it's going to be low when if these patients have inflammation. We don't check prealbumin as often, and we go by the anthropometric data usually and how much weight loss they've had from their baseline to kind of for weight restoration purposes. Yeah. Did you mean more specific?
About protein losing neuropathy, many of them will have had significant weight, and I was just wondering if you make an adjustment for those people compared to people who are not in that situation.
Yeah, they definitely probably lose protein and severe inflammation when they're stooling a lot, but we know that their needs for protein are higher. So I'm happy even if they can tolerate 2 grams per kilo, for example, of protein, as much as they can tolerate eating. Usually they're already self-limited. So.
You mentioned several commercially available products like Lara bars. How are you evaluating whether they are acceptable for, and you're smiling, because you can
Doesn't
look
like
at
them.
ingredients. It doesn't tell you where they're sourced. It doesn't tell you, because they have to average those things, and if they're in a certain
Right.
percent. So how do you decide what's legal and illegal on a commercial product?
It's definitely more challenging. And we try and counsel that these are available, but we don't know how they're prepared. Just like most foods, balsamic vinegar, for example, has sugar been added to it. We have had junk food SCDers that come in, and I didn't mention any of the trace elements in this presentation because, for example, we've called the Lara Bar company to ask, do you have any trace elements in your products? And they're like, what? And the nutrient analysis program usually doesn't evaluate for those either. So we can't really assess, are they meeting the requirement or the RDA for trace elements. But as a whole, we try and steer away from the prepared SCD products, and I try and encourage increased calories with whole foods. But they're a better option than the products that we know that have food additives. And not all Lara bars are SCD legal either by based on ingredients. So I educate them around that too.
Can you talk more about two things? The first one's legumes. I noticed you put an asterisk.
Yes.
Yeah, and then the second one is just a little bit more talk about dairy because it trips me up a bit. I noticed like 24-hour fermented yogurt's okay. Is it just because all the lactose is consumed as fuel? And if that's the case, would like lactose-free milk be okay? Or like whey protein, which is
Just the protein powder. Okay, I'm going to try and remember those. Legumes. What was the second one? Legumes and dairy. Okay. As far as legumes go, the best resource we have right now is Elaine Gottschall's book. So we think that, different legumes have different composition of carbohydrates. I still think it's really important for kids to get lentils, beans, as that does provide some starch for them, which helps with their energy quite a bit. But for example, garbanzo beans are not initially legal, and I don't know if that comes from how they were prepared in the can or if the thought process initially was based on their carbohydrate content. And that's why we're working to add things back in. Like my case study patient added back chickpeas just fine. So we have a suspicion that certain foods will be well tolerated, but we start with the restricted version first. So we go with the websites that are currently available and what foods they allow and don't allow on the diet. I'll add to it.
I think another really important point when we talk about the SCD diet, or actually any real dietary therapy, is that this diet did not come out of a well thought of scientific research project, right? Somebody did this diet and it worked, and that's phenomenal. So really, I think what we need to do, what science needs to do, is really look at the specifics now, and I think that hopefully that's what we're doing and other programs are doing. We know that, yes, this diet as defined by Haas and Gottschall, it works. But we don't know that it needs to be specifically that strict for every individual. And we don't know why it works. I mean, these diets, again, develop from anecdotal experience. And it doesn't mean that that's not good. It's phenomenal. It just means that a lot of research really needs to be done in piecing the diet out.
And we're trying to partner, at least here. One of our physicians works closely with food scientists. We're really trying to get them on board, as well as the microbiome piece. Hearing your talk today made me really excited about what's to come with that. But food scientists looking at when foods change, if they're organic versus not organic, if they're hot or cold, all of that changes the composition of the food that we don't even capture in any of this. So we're hoping to partner with them and have more research to come out on that too. As far as the calcium goes, to finish that question, the yogurt, again, it's coming from what worked for them, but the fermentation process does get rid of a lot of the lactose, and over time and eventually we may be able to use like a more organic plain yogurt, but for now we still have the families make it with organic milk and a specific culture starter. And same thing with the cheeses. We don't do soft cheeses because they're higher in lactose, and whereas the harder cheeses or things like Swiss have been aged for a lot longer.
So I hope I didn't miss this, but with the microbiome piece and the dietary piece, do you encourage consuming fermented foods like sauerkraut to
Yes,
automatically stay on
yes, and probably about 75% of families ask if they should be on a probiotic, and which is always the hard question. And I equally say, we can get lots of probiotics in the diet, and I'm thankful that fermented yogurt is a part of that. So that's one source, and I do encourage, if they will eat them, something like kimchi or sauerkraut, or even fermenting their own things at home, just to give more biodiversity.
So if you were to make kombucha at home with honey specifically as the fuel source, would that be an acceptable
Yeah.
option as well?
Yeah, and 100% fruit juice or something as the sugar. Yeah. Paula.
Hi, Kim. Thank you for your presentation.
Yes.
I have two questions for you. One is about carbohydrate. Do you have a sense of percent of carbohydrate per total caloric intake?
I knew a dietitian would ask me this. I haven't looked at it yet in the nutrient analysis program, but based on just the protein data, the protein intake is quite a bit higher, but it's within the realm of what we would estimate for a kid with IBD and increased calorie needs with that activity and the inflammatory factor added on. So my hunch is it's less than what the AMDR has. So it's probably, I would be a guess, but I would guess about 20 to 30% because they still are getting carbohydrates from the legumes, from the lentils, and from fruit. And I think we always think that grains are the only source of carbohydrate, but they're not.
And my second question was, glancing the cookbook, and there's a lot of use in coconut oil.
Yes.
Is there a particular reason for it, or can someone use olive oil or avocado oil or grapeseed oil?
Yes, I think it's partly because it's really trendy right now. So I try and do from a nutrition standpoint, say, it's not the best frying oil, it's not the best sauteing oil, it's better in baked goods. So I think flavor is part of it. It's popular, so I think families want to cook with it. But I try and include or counsel on the more variety, the better. So avocado oil, grapeseed oil, flaxseed oil, they all give different essential nutrients, and cooking with more variety is best.
Just a quick comment about that oil and the comment you made about coconut. The main reason I asked is because I mainly deal with kids with higher cholesterol and lipids. So, if they do have a existing condition, that may, I would rather ask them to do that.
Yes, and that brings up a good point. We don't know how the high-fat diet affects them long-term. These kids, we haven't looked at it. We have very few overweight kids or kids that have high cholesterol coming in with IBD. But it's something I think of too, and I do mention that, it is a saturated fat. So we do want to look at other oils as well. Mm-hmm.
I have two questions. One to clarify, you do check A, E, K, and D at baseline?
Not in every case. We do a D.
Just D, yeah, that's common, but A, E, and K not always.
If they're malnourished or they have malabsorption, if they're stooling a lot, we will, but it's not standard of care, no.
And then there's been the reintroduction of food. It's not not done always. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Is it one food at a time for over a week? And then do you decide not to do it if there's certain clinical parameters?
Yeah, so by the end of kind of the 12 weeks or once they reach remission, we like them to stay in remission for at least, I would say, a month or so. And then from there, if they're interested in kind of expanding the diet, then we will try and add back foods that we've had good experience with and that we suspect will be fine. So for example, with organic rice, we'll say, okay, you need at least three to five servings of this food in a week. And I tell them that because suddenly rice can become the favorite food and be in everything. And we don't want that either. And then we've usually checked a stool calprotectin and all the other inflammatory markers. So thereafter, we wait about 3 to 4 weeks. And then our doctors will order another follow-up stool calprotectin. And usually we go with just that marker, aside from kind of their normal clinic follow-up and the labs that we get at each screening visit.
And you're choosing the foods based on kind of most nutrient value, best budget. It's not, or do you always start with rice? Or?
Usually we do what they want to really miss.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
that makes it fun.
Yeah, it makes it a little more exciting, yeah.
Is there any restriction or donation about spices?
Great question. No, you can have herbs, spices, Johnny's seasoning mix is no. Things with added sugar and starch they can't have, but as far as fresh herbs, Indian spices, things like that, those are all fine to make things a little more exciting. Yeah.
You had asked about lactose-free milk and
Oh, yes.
and as well as what about like hemp milk? If it have open gluten, there's some milk alternatives that could potentially work, but on some of the lists are still listed as a no.
Yes, that's a great question that I didn't mention. Almost all, I've yet to find a brand, some families say they've found one, but almost all milk substitutes have additives in them, whether it's carrageenan, polysorbate, the list is endless. Soy lecithin, something in them to improve the texture or taste. So most of our families make homemade nut milk. It's really easy and it's delicious. Like the almond milk is hands down my favorite now. As far as the lactose-free milk goes, it's also controversial, but we suspect that there may be some relationship also with milk protein. We know that milk is more of an inflammatory food. So if it's not fermented, and again, with the whey supplement, we try not to have any concentrated protein powders that we add also.
So,
Gotta
thank
go.
you very much.